number 10, we have North Korean starvation rumors. None of us really know what's going on in North Korea. We would like to think that we have an idea, but it's all rumors. There are very few people who have been able to escape the struggles of that country, but most of the secrets are well hidden. And while their leader would like to boast like they have a strong economic standing within their walls, there are several stories that say otherwise. One of those stories has been of great famines in impoverished areas. This causes the people to chase down anything for food. Because much of the soil isn't fertile enough to grow crops, some people have had to turn to eating bugs or stray animals to stop from dying from starvation. There are even rumors that when times get really tough, people will go missing, and some people are turning to cannibalism just so they have something to eat. Next on the list, we have Leendert Hassenbosch, a Dutch sailor who was kicked off the boat he was stationed at and left to die. He was exiled for sodomy, and he was left on an island alone in the year 1725. He had a diary which was found later, but his body was never found. It would seem that he might have lasted for a year and a half on the island, but struggled to find food. He most likely had to drink turtle blood and his own urine to stay alive. Some think that he might have made it off the island with a passing ship and never told anyone who he was, since the crew would have left him there if they found out that he performed sodomy. It was different back then. People were a lot more closed-minded. Next on the list, we have Witold GLINSKI. When you're on the run from the law during World War II, you better never look back, especially when you're Polish and the law is the Soviet Union. He was imprisoned in a gulag, but he was clever enough to come up with a plan with some of the people that were locked away in there. They figured out how to escape and they were successful, but that was just where the story starts. They were now in the middle of a frozen wasteland in Siberia, and if anyone found them, they would be executed. It seemed like the military or the cold would kill them, but they weren't about to quit, so they started walking and they managed to hike all the way through Siberia and make it to the Gobi Desert. They crossed that, and then they made it to the Himalayas and they crossed those as well to make it into India, which at the time was controlled by the British, so they were now safe. The journey was both dangerous and difficult. They had to suck moss just so they wouldn't die from dehydration. They would catch food here and there, but for most of the venture they had to go days without food. Next on the list, we have Otokichi. Imagine being 14 and stranded in the ocean. This was the wild story of Otokichi. He was a Japanese teenager working on a boat in the 1800s. It was a transport vessel that would mainly work with rice. Well, one day things didn't go as planned and the ship got blown off course and the sails were destroyed. Now these guys had to find some way to live, so they just started eating the rice. How long do you think you could live off of rice? Well, for Otokichi, it was 4 months. Several of the other crewmates died, but this dude kept living. Eventually, they washed up on the shore of the Washington Olympic Peninsula, and you would think that they would be saying, "Thank God we are saved." Well, that was before they were taken into slavery by a local tribe. Yeah, things just kept getting worse. They were eventually freed when they were passed on to the Hudson Bay Company. Next on the list, we have Debbie KILEY. Debbie went out on a fishing trip with some friends that went pretty sour pretty fast. The boat ended up flipping, and the crew tried to get a life raft together before the people went down, but they only got it half inflated, so the 5 people left had to hold onto this dinghy, and all of them but Debbie and one other man would die. People became so thirsty that they drank seawater, which caused them to hallucinate from dehydration and drift off into the water. Debbie survived and wrote a couple of books about her experience. Next on the list, we have the Alexanders. Oh, we have more than one family that watched their boat tip over and fill with water. This time we got the Alexanders. For this story, we got to zoom over to the 80s and meet up with a family that wasn't planning on living out at sea, but wanted to go for a nice day of sailing. Well, it turns out that the weather wasn't on their side and they ended up flipping their boat. This thing sank faster than the Titanic on Fast Forward, and now both parents and their 2 kids were floating out in the ocean. The waters were freezing and they only had one option. They had to swim, and eventually they made it to an island. The struggle now was that there wasn't anyone else on the island. The family was now forced to survive without any food, so they went hunting and fishing. Luckily, it rained quite a bit while they were on the island, so they had something to drink, but both parents admitted afterwards that they thought they were going to have to watch the other person die, and if it came to that, they thought they might even have to eat them. Next on the list, we have Alexander SELKIRK. How long do you think you could last if you were stranded? I don't know how long I would go for. I would think that I would be tough enough to keep myself alive for a little while, but I don't know if I could last as long as this guy. This is the story of Alexander SELKIRK. He was a Scottish sailor who was kicked off his ship and left on an island. This was back in the 1700s. So the people on board were sure that they just left him to die. Well, it turns out they were wrong. The dude spent 4 years out there and never wavered. suffered. Starvation started to get him, but then he became resourceful and was able to find shellfish to live off of. The sea was providing him with a ton of food, but then sea lions came to the shore and pushed him into the jungle. Now, to make sure he didn't starve, he had to chase down wild goats and milk them. At night he would be attacked by rats, but he solved the problem by finding wild cats that would hunt around him if he fed them to keep them close. Eventually he was saved. I wonder if he still ever thought he would be saved after spending 4 years on an island alone. Next on the list we have YOSSI GHINSBERG. Formerly in the Israeli army, YOSSI wanted to do something amazing with his life. He was 21 years old and he wanted to trek into the Amazon rainforest and find places that no one had ever been before. He planned on doing this alone, but while traveling he met 3 other men. 2 of the men were fellow adventurers and the other was a geologist who knew the land and told them where they could find some small villages within the rainforest. They eventually made it to the Amazon rainforest and stopped at a small village to stock up on supplies and then headed on. After a few days of traveling, it was clear that they were lost and eventually the truth came out. The geologist who apparently knew the land, he was a con man who had tricked them into exploring the jungle with him because he was trying to find a hidden stash of gold to steal from the Amazon people. Well, now none of them knew their way out and the group parted ways. YOSSI and another member of the group jumped on a raft that they made themselves and started to head down a river. The raft broke apart and the 2 men were separated when YOSSI went over a waterfall. For the next 3 weeks, YOSSI wandered around the rainforest being eaten by bugs and doing whatever he could to survive. He would scavenge for dead animals to eat and steal eggs from nests. Eventually he was sure that he was going to die when he couldn't walk from the amount of pain in his limbs. Then he was rescued by the very friend that was separated from him on the raft. This guy came back with a boat to find him. The other 2, no one knows what happened to them.
Starting off this countdown, we have the desert. Back in 2011, 84-year-old Henry Morello was driving to his home outside of Phoenix, Arizona, when he took a wrong turn. He attempted to make a U-turn and ended up crashing in a ditch. He was left there stranded with a dead cell phone. For 5 days, Henry waited, hoping someone would come to his rescue. During the cold nights, he would huddle under his floor mats. But it got to the point where he needed something to eat and drink. So he started to drink his windshield washer fluid. Thankfully, a couple of days later, a pair of hikers saw his car and came to his rescue. Now, just because Henry survived off of windshield wiper fluid does not mean you should go drink it. No, doctors say he's lucky because it could have killed him. And if you guys are liking this video so far, make sure to give it a big thumbs up because it really helps us out. In our 9th spot, we have POON Lim. POON Lim was a Chinese sailor on a British merchant vessel during World War II. The ship was on its way to New York when it was attacked by a German U-boat. The ship was completely destroyed, but POON managed to escape, and he managed to survive 133 days alone in the South Atlantic. It's pretty unbelievable. POON survived by catching and eating live birds. He would drink their blood to quench his thirst. He also used his minimal resources to catch sharks. He would catch them, then drink the blood from the shark's liver to survive. In the end, he was rescued by some fishermen. After all he had been through for 133 days, he only lost 20 pounds. So clearly, he got enough calories. And at number 8, we have the Grand Canyon Adventure. On December 22nd, 2016, a woman named Karen Klein, her husband Eric Klein, and their son were on a road trip to the Grand Canyon. However, their GPS system was faulty and kept leading them onto closed roads. Eventually, while following the GPS, the car ended up in a muddy ditch. There was no cell service, so Karen decided to go out for help. But while out, a huge snowstorm hit. She found shelter under a spruce tree. Apparently, she kept herself awake by replaying Star Trek episodes in her head. That's just a little fun fact I thought I'd throw in there. Star Trek literally kept her alive. As Karen continued on, she eventually pulled a groin muscle and lost a shoe. She was cold and suffering from hallucinations. She ended up eating pine needles and drinking her urine to survive. 36 hours later, on Christmas Eve, Rangers found Karen. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the USS Indianapolis. On July 30th, 1945, the USS Indianapolis was struck by 2 torpedoes. Within 12 minutes, the boat sunk completely. Now, they didn't have enough lifeboats for all the men on board, so most strapped on a life jacket and then just jumped into the waters. Of the 900 that survived the initial sinking, only 316 made it out of the waters alive. Those that survived shared their story. So according to them, for days they were just floating around at sea. Some Some were killed by hungry sharks. Others passed away from dehydration. In fact, men were so desperate that they started drinking the salt water, but this caused them to become delirious. Got so bad that the men started to attack and harm each other. Others would see things in the water. They would yell that they saw food in the water. They would then swim down and never return. To this day, it's said to be one of the worst sea disasters in US naval history. Moving on to number 4, we have the Princess of Wales shipwreck. In 1820, the Princess of Wales ship set out on a seal hunting voyage, but it ended badly when the ship crashed in March of 1821 at the Crozet Islands. Now, there was not a lot of food on the island to keep the crew alive, so they started killing sea elephants. So according to one of the crewmen, they would wash in the sea elephant's blood. Then they would eat their brains raw. And apparently it tasted sweet like sugar. Yeah, that's what they said. Some managed to survive this accident by strictly eating brains. Moving on to number 3, we have MAURO Prosperi. In 1994, 39-year-old MAURO Prosperi took place in a 6-day marathon through the Sahara Desert. Every 10 kilometers, there was a refreshment point for the runners to refuel themselves. But on the 4th day, a huge sandstorm struck. MAURO was covered by the sand. It was fine though. He freed himself and kept going once the storm was over. Only problem was, he no longer knew which way to go. He ended up traveling 4 hours in the wrong direction. He was running out of supplies when he realized that he was lost. At one point, he found a marabout and stayed there for quite some time. There, he would capture and drink the blood of bats and also drink his own urine to survive. He also did the same to snakes and lizards. He would catch them, drink their blood, and then eat them raw. That is hardcore. Finally, after several days, he was found and rescued. Moving on to number 2, we have the expedition. Back in 1845, Sir John Franklin led 2 ships filled with 129 men to explore the Canadian Arctic in search of the Northwest Passage. However, along the way, the ships ended up getting stuck in ice, and they all faced a chilling death. But thanks to the ice, the bodies of the crewmen were preserved. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers recovered the remains of the crew on King William Island, and they found some pretty terrifying things. It was thought that the crew resorted to cannibalism for their last couple of days. They had food aboard the ship, but many were sick from scurvy and tuberculosis, hypothermia, and pneumonia, which made them disoriented and wild. The crew were found with cut marks all over their body, indicating that their flesh was cut off the bone and eaten. On other men, their bones had been cracked open and the bone marrow was feasted on.